Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Chocolate Life Live. Episode 61, we're going to be talking about cadmium again. And the order for today is going to be a little out of sync. I'm waiting for my guest, Keith Ayoob. He has been unavoidably detained, and I'm hoping that he's going to get an opportunity to join us in the next couple of minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a few more minutes than I might in the introduction. Then I'm going to go to another bit of the topic that I had prepared for today. We'll start in on that until Keith joins us. Oh, Keith, you've arrived. What I need you to do is not join the stream from YouTube or LinkedIn and Facebook. If you go to your messages, what you'll do is you'll see that I sent you a link so that you come into the StreamYard studio and I can get your face up on screen. I can't get your face up on screen as a comment from where you are. So please go take a look. I just sent you a text message. Open up that text message in your browser and I will let you in. That's the way it works. All right. Until we get that taken care of, good to know that Keith is here. What I want to do is I want to talk about some of the difficulties that are associated with data. And the data that we get, unless you are really, really dedicated and really have an understanding of it, can sometimes be very, very difficult to take a look through. And sometimes, I'm not saying that this is a deliberate move. What I'm saying is that oftentimes, the people who put these things together may not be data geeks, or what they may not be aware of is, that the way the data are presented makes it very, very difficult to be able to understand the data. And so right now on the website right now on the screen is the website for a group called As You Sow. And As You Sow is a nonprofit organization. And what they've been doing is they've been food safety advocates. They've been looking at issues which appear to be food or additives in food or ingredients in food that could be injurious to the public health. And what they do is they do some research and then they engage in a number of actions which are designed to bring this threat, as they see it, to public attention and perhaps affect legislation. And this is what they have been successful in doing in California, Proposition 65. There are now, hey, here's Keith. Yay, Keith. Hey, how are you, Keith?
Hi there, how are you?
I'm doing quite well. Sorry for the confusion.
No problem. I'm glad. Thank you for your good instruction.
Yeah, not a problem. So, if you don't mind, what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue with where I started, which is I'm going to go over some of the numbers that were presented around cadmium that we're going to be reacting to. Okay, do you mind? Because I've started it. All right. So let's go do that. So here I have the page on the As You Sow website, and I'm going to put the link to this page in today's post after the live stream, so you can go there and you don't have to worry about copying the URL or anything like that. But first things first, if you want to read the 385-page report, you can click on this little icon here, and you'll be able to read the entire report. It's pretty dense reading, but at least you have the research that all of this is based upon. So Keith, if you had a chance to read this report in detail, do you know what it is that's here? You have muted yourself, Keith. Okay. You have to unmute yourself, Keith. I can't unmute you.
How do I? Oh, now it seems to have stopped.
No worries.
Or actually, now it's again. I'm sorry for the tech, but how do I stop the echo here?
All right. So if you go into your settings menu and you click on audio, there is a thing called echo cancellation. Just check the box and close. Or put
Yes.
headphones on, which is what I do.
What's that?
Right. Or put headphones on, which is what I do. So what I want to do is, I mean, have you had a chance to read this research? Do you know where As You Sow is coming from when they do this?
I am sorry, but I did check echo cancellation, and
Okay.
it
Do you have a set of headphones you can put on?
yeah. Let me see if I can get
Okay.
that.
All right. So while you're doing that, I will mute you, and I'll go through and talk about the data. So if you click, see the results, click here. What it will do is it will take you down to a table, right? And this table has a couple of key data point columns. Number one is they let you know the company. So here is data from the Hershey company, right? It is the Cadbury Mini Eggs Milk Chocolate with crisps sugar shell. So one of the things that people may or may not know about is that most of the Cadbury products sold in the United States are actually manufactured by Hershey under license from Cadbury. And that has to do with the difference in regulations about what is and is not legally chocolate, and the differences between the EU and UK regulations and the US regulations. You'll find that there is a test date, and you'll find that there is an analysis of the amount of lead and the amount of cadmium in each serving that they detected. And these numbers are based upon the serving size that's on the label. And so if you're in green here, what that means is that the amount detected was below the minimum daily load, which is recognized by health officials here in the United States. And if it's red, it means that consuming one serving gives you more than you should consume in one day of this particular metal, right? So, Keith, do you have anything to add to that? Sort of, it seems to be very, very simple, and it looks to me like when you get this table for the first time, it seems to be sorted by the date of the test. So the most recent tests are first, and then alphabetically by the company involved, right? So it seems to be fairly straightforward. The challenges become, you can sort it. So I can click on the cadmium per serving. And here what we get is there was, very, very low levels of cadmium. That's what these three dotted lines are, right? But if I click on this side, what I do is, for some reason, it's an artifice of the sort that not detected is higher than detected. But we sort, and what we do is we find that for this particular product, it's manufactured by Taza. It is their Wicked Dark with Toasted Coconut 95 Dark. What we do is they find that a single serving will deliver 9.9 milligrams or micrograms of cadmium in that serving. So, Keith,
Yes.
So I want to introduce you a little bit. Keith is a colleague. We've known each other for a number of years. He's a contributor to The Chocolate Life. He is a pediatric nutritionist and has been affiliated, or is still affiliated, to the Albert Einstein College of Medicine here in New York City. And we've been talking about a number of topics related to nutrition, as well as health benefits of cocoa and chocolate, and heavy metals and other things that might be in chocolate which may not be good for you. So Keith, without going into your story, which I want to get to, what are your thoughts about how the levels that are determined acceptable are reached, and then what that means, and how it might be different for an adult as compared with a child, right? So.
And while you never want to take necessarily one food and look at that and expect all of the diet to be that way. So this is one food, but just like, well, you could look at a piece of say beef or a soybean or something and say, well, that is completely devoid of vitamin C. There's nothing in there that's going to give you. On the other hand, it's assumed that you're going to eat a varied diet, okay? And it's going to eat. If you have a balanced varied diet, it will work out. In this situation, you've got cadmium that's very high in one item, in like one serving of food. Now, two things happen. Are the recommended levels or the allowable levels appropriate? And are you getting too much of that in the course of your whole diet?
Mhm.
And does that matter in a sense? And look at the big picture. Now, does it matter? Yes, except what bothered me is that I eat really dark chocolate. I have never heard of anybody getting cadmium toxicity from eating chocolate or frankly any other food, unless they were next door to some kind of a toxic waste plant, and it's dumping toxic waste and they're
Right.
growing it in their soil. So these kinds of things. I also asked a colleague of mine who is a toxicologist. And I was at a meeting, I was on a panel with her, and I said, and actually she has one of the paper that's one of the papers I found was a recent one with her authorship. And I said, is cadmium in like chocolate? I mean, is this really a problem? Because I scoured PubMed and I just couldn't find anything. And usually you hear about this. Usually you will get warnings about this. For them to, to be passing acceptable levels, I first have to ask, is this a problem? And I couldn't find what it was. And I said, what's the deal with cadmium and chocolate and cadmium in food? And and like, do I need to be worried? And she said, how bad a problem is cadmium toxicity? And she says, well, it can be a problem. She says, but not from food. And she looked at me like I had two heads and said, like, what? And then this is I've known Berna Magnuson for a number of years. She plays it straight up the middle. There is, the data are what the data are, but they have to be acceptable. And she doesn't pull any punches.
Right. So let's
we've talked about a lot of credibility. So I look at this chart, Clay, and I would say, okay, it's got more, but the question then is, exposure doesn't necessarily mean toxicity.
So that's where I wanted to go next. So we've had this conversation. I mean, just because you consume something. So for example, people look at something like the ORAC level, the oxygen radical absorbance capacity of a food. And for many, many years, ORAC rating was concerned to be, was the primary way that people talked about the health-giving products, components of cocoa and chocolate.
It was the antioxidant rival.
Right. And it's become more complicated since then as we learn more about the science of what's going on. But, we've discussed about this before, which is that what you put in your mouth is not necessarily what ends up in your bloodstream or ends up in your liver.
Right.
And so we have individual metabolisms. And so, the amount in the product is the baseline. Well, here's what we're starting with it. The question is what ends up in the blood or what ends up in the liver. And I think one of the things that you pointed out, which is also really important, is that right now there is no differentiation between whether this amount is consumed by somebody with a body weight of 20 kilograms or somebody with a body weight of 80 kilograms. And it would make sense that there is a difference there, and that the risk to, somebody who weighs, 45 pounds, a small child, is going to be at consuming these levels is going to be much greater than somebody who weighs 4 or 5 times as much.
Sure. With toxicity, you always want to take into account body weight because for exactly the reasons that you stated. So a lot of times toxicity levels are listed at X number of milligrams or micrograms per kilo of body weight, et cetera. So that, it does make sense. On the other hand, as a clinician, I also have to have my feet on the ground and say, how many 5-year-olds are eating 95% chocolate?
Right.
And probably nobody. And if they are, and they're eating it in large amounts on a daily basis, we might have other issues going on.
Right. They might be consuming it in cocoa powder. In terms of drinking chocolate.
Yeah, even then they'd have to be consuming it on a lot of, well, actually, you know what, that actually, I do consume it in cocoa powder. So which
Right.
is
But I've
exactly
seen
one of
you
the reasons I
more than
wanted to
20
get this
kilos.
free.
Right.
What? Pardon?
I've seen you weigh more than 20 kilos.
Oh yeah, well that's true. Yes,
Yeah.
but I also consume a lot of cocoa powder. I like a
Yeah.
lot of hot liquids, and
Mm.
I like my chocolate dark, not too sweet, the whole bit. So that kind of spurred me and say, look, is this too much for me? And there's acute exposure. Clearly, I wasn't having a problem with acute exposure, but there's also chronic exposure. And if people are chronically exposed to a toxic metal, it can have it can have consequences in the liver and the kidneys. And with cadmium, tends to be kidneys. Well, I don't want kidney problems as I get older, so I thought, nobody does. And I just wanted to find out once and for all. And that's what led me to my first article, which was get your blood tested. And I thought, okay, how am I going to go and try and explain this to my internist, who's going to, again, think I lost my mind? And so he's like, please, as did Bernard Magnuson, my toxicology friend, who said, it's like, take a day off, Keith, And so I sort of said, I found a website online that would do it at a legitimate lab. And I thought, okay. And I thought, oh, and they didn't ask any questions. They drew my blood, gave me a result in several days, and it was way low. Well within normal, put it this way.
Okay.
And normal levels were, I think,
it's like half a microgram per liter or something like that.
Yeah,
yes,
it's like
fairly small.
per 100 mils.
And
I think, and for smokers, the reference range was something like it starts at 5 milligrams.
Right. So if anybody wants to know the numbers that Keith is referring to, what you can do is you can go to TheChocolateLife.com. You can go to the post with this image on it. It's currently pinned in the top rail of the homepage, so you can go there. Just click on it and you'll go to this page. And one of the things that Keith does is he talks about what the levels are in terms of how much per 100 mLs in blood for, you need to worry about. So yeah, those numbers are here on this post.
You can click on that first link. It says landmark article. That was last year's article where I did blood. Why did I do blood? Well, blood shows an acute response to that, to an intake. I did urine this year because it's more suggestive.
Can I, before you jump into that, sure. Keith, what I would like to say is when you say an acute response, so a blood test will say, I have been exposed to high levels of, in this case, cadmium, right? In the last 24 hours?
Actually that
right. But when you say acute exposure, it is sometime in the recent past.
Oh, yes.
In the very recent past.
Yes.
Okay. So that's important to know. So that blood tests measure one thing in this particular regard. They shouldn't be taken as, so if you show signs of cadmium toxicity, poisoning, and you take a blood test and the blood test says it's low, so the exposure has not been recent, right? So what you might want to do is you might want to explore other forms of testing in order to find out if in fact there has been long-term chronic exposure.
Right. And keep in mind, this is, chocolate and cocoa powder are not the only forms of cadmium. It seems to be the one form, and this is another little bee in my bonnet, is that it is not even the major source of cadmium in the diet. Right. The major sources are going to be in, grains, roots, stem vegetables, et cetera, et cetera. So we eat a lot more of those in a lot greater quantity, and a lot more, people eat these daily, and they need to eat these daily. So it's important to kind of put that umbrella over this, so that it's not, a problem. And actually, when I looked at where the sources of cadmium are in the diet, cocoa was sort of lumped into confectionery, sweets, etc. And even then, it was way low on the list. I mean, it was just not a big contributor. Now, that said, there are those of us for whom it might occupy a higher percentage of our diet. So you don't want to rule anything out either. And, and while the blood result did not show anything, and it didn't show there was acute exposure, I had to take that with somewhat of a grain of salt, pardon the pun. But even though I consume a lot of cocoa powder, and cocoa powder gram for gram is a really concentrated source of cadmium, potentially.
Mm-hmm.
And I took it to the next step for this article and looked at chronic exposure, because my exposure to cadmium, or at least to cocoa powder and chocolate, have been pretty consistent for the past year or for many years. And if there is a problem with chronic exposure, now I would be able to find that out.
Gotcha. And that is why you took a urine test. Before you go into there, in your experience, so I'm looking at the sources of food cadmium, so cereals and bread. I mean, I think it's ironic that the wheat grown in Western Europe actually contains higher levels of cadmium, and we're likely to consume them in the bread we eat daily in much higher quantities than the cocoa or chocolate that we're eating, right? But where does sugar fit on this list? Or is sugar, or do you know if cadmium is at all a contributor to, or sugar is a contributor to cadmium levels at all?
I actually don't think it is. At least you're talking about cane sugar. Now, beet sugar, possibly, because
it fits in that root vegetable category.
Right.
Okay.
It is sort of a root vegetable, although it's pretty purified. I don't know. And at the same time, the highest contributors were the ones that you see on the screen there.
Yep.
Sugar, candy, chocolate, cocoa, that all fell into sweets and confectionary, which was a tiny category. It was like
well below legumes and nuts in
absolutely
terms of contribution.
It was on the order of like between 1% and 3%, something like that.
Gotcha.
So not a big issue.
Okay, so if I can, before we jump into this, because I think this is really important. So this is the sources of cadmium in things we put in our mouth, not necessarily in terms of metabolites. It's not what ends up, correct?
Correct. And okay. Cadmium is something that also can be inhaled.
Right, which is smoking.
I'm sorry.
Right.
Not cadmium. We are going to be talking about another compound later that will be inhalable. But cadmium, yes, we're talking about cadmium that is found in our food that we take orally.
Gotcha. So here's the question that I have, because I seem to remember our talking about this before we got in our preparations from this, is it appears that there are other foods that we would eat in combination with these foods that might actually reduce the bioavailability of the cadmium that we're consuming orally. Is that correct?
So it is. And it's ironic that many of the foods that we want people to eat more of, particularly things like green leafy vegetables, and actually a lot of vegetables and fruits, including even some of the root and stem vegetables, have compounds in them that are binders, so to speak.
Okay. So they naturally chelate.
They actually kind of chelate and prevent, and also fiber that inhibits the absorption and the uptake of cadmium. So they provide their own, minerals. And it may be, and I say may because I can't say for sure, this is not my area of expertise, but it may be that those high vitamin and mineral sources compete for absorption, and cadmium kind of loses out there.
Right. So if we think about the fiber, which might be found in a whole wheat bread, it may be that the fiber is interfering with the uptake of cadmium into the bloodstream.
Yes,
for example,
in the fiber, and then there's also phytic acid in whole grains, and phytic acid in a lot of green leafy and stem vegetables.
Can I ask a question related to that? Is phytic acid toxic?
No. Well, no, but I mean, not if it's found in food. The only thing is, it's in some people who are prone to certain types of renal stones, they may need to go on a low phytate diet. So that can be a problem because certain types of kidney stones, not all.
Right. So the reason why I mentioned it is because there is some chatter in the raw chocolate community that one of the things you need to avoid in your chocolate consumption is phytic acid. And I was never able to see a connection between phytic acid and, acute toxicity or even chronic exposure toxicity.
Yeah, and what phytate can do is also bind some nutrients and prevent nutrients we need from being absorbed. It tends to bind, for example, iron can bind with it and things like that. So, I have the raw food community has its own ideas
Gotcha.
about
Yeah.
a lot of different types of nutrition. I am not a big fan of improperly cooked food, and
Or
so
uncooked food, right?
or like unsafely
Right,
cooked
right.
food. Yes,
Gotcha.
some
Gotcha.
things fine to eat raw,
Yeah.
but not necessarily everything.
Okay. So, Keith, what I want to do is I want to take a quick break here. What I want to do is acknowledge Mark and Yuri from Blue Spruce in Colorado for watching today. Thank you very much. If you're watching, put a comment in the replay, in the chat, in the comment section. Let us know where you're calling in from today. I can tell whether you're calling in from YouTube or you're here on LinkedIn, but let us know what part of the world you're from, so that we can just see what the distribution of watchers is going to be. But we have a question, our first question, right? Keith, which is Kurt asks, was there some event or some particular situation that was the impetus to shock and concern about cadmium in chocolate?
Kurt, thank you for asking that question, because I've asked it myself and I can't find out why. So it's one of those things where I think if to whoever the governing regulatory bodies are, once you pair the term cadmium and food, all sorts of alarms begin to go off. And if it's a food that could be, that people like, and that also the kids might be eating, et cetera, it starts to get people going. Now, as Clay had mentioned, it's also in grains. It's also in a lot of fruits and vegetables. Why are we not worried about that? I don't know. I really don't know. And I think you ask a very good question. It's like, if we go and make all these decisions about upper levels of cadmium that are in chocolate, what are we going to do about cereal and bread? And what are we going to do about vegetables and potatoes and things that have sustained people for thousands of years? And by the way, cadmium is not new. Cadmium's an element. It's always been in the soil. It's always going to be in the soil. It will always be in our food. So there's not much you can do about that. So I have no idea. And I think you ask a good question.
Yeah. So Kurt, I have also done inquiries to people who've been in the industry for quite some time and have never been able to find what I think of as a satisfactory exploration for why there is a focus on chocolate as a source of cadmium, or cacao as a source of cadmium, as opposed to other things which are potentially much higher in cadmium, or they occupy a much higher percentage of the diet. For example, grains, which are grown in Europe. They seem to be high in cadmium. They seem to form a much larger part of our diet, and so they represent a much larger potential for chronic exposure and toxicity associated with that. And yet, there's a focus on cocoa and chocolate. I mean, we have issues with child labor in lots of supply chains, but the focus appears to be on chocolate. And the question is why? Why are cocoa and chocolate being singled out? And that's another question that has never been able to be satisfactorily explained to me. There is one, you could call it a conspiracy theory. Some people have poo-pooed it and said, there's no way this is happening. And some people have said, it's plausible, but perhaps not probable that this is the case. And it's protectionist legislation. Right. So what this is doing is it's unfairly advantaging companies or countries where cadmium levels in the soil are naturally very low. Right. Mostly West Africa. Right. And that it is disadvantaging countries where cadmium levels are naturally very high. And this is the Americas and volcanic islands anywhere. So it could be that this is a way for the big producing countries and the big consuming countries to be able to have a socially acceptable form of trade policy, which seems to disadvantage one group over another. And they're doing so out of fear mongering more than actual science-based considerations.
And Kurt,
Sure.
one
Let's put the question back up if you're going to respond to Kurt.
One other parallel that I see of something it reminded me of this is that years ago I was excuse me, I was attending a talk on PCB levels in farmed salmon. PCBs are polychlorinated biphenyls, and they are, present. They're present. They can be present anywhere, but those are a product of industry, industrial waste dumping, etc. At any rate, they find their way throughout the world now, and in farmed salmon, they were higher than they were in wild salmon. And so people think, well, don't eat farmed salmon because it's high in PCBs. And I started looking at some of the data, and this was government data. It wasn't, it was government data about other sources of PCBs. Mm-hmm. And foods that we eat more commonly, like roast chicken, ounce for ounce, were higher in PCBs. And I thought, well, okay, well, we're eating a whole lot more chicken than we are salmon, and nobody seems to be worried about chicken, nor should they be. Why are we talking about this? And the people who farm salmon were saying, we don't know. But they kind of asked the same question. So it's not something that's exclusive to cadmium and chocolate.
Right. No, we have mercury levels in fish and other heavy metal levels in seafood. I suppose seafood better than fish.
But mercury, that can be a problem. I mean, and I do know people who have had, a couple of people who have had mercury toxicity from eating too much tuna fish, for example, especially raw tuna. So that can happen. It's not common, very not common, but it can happen. But that's more of a concern.
Okay. Is it because mercury as a metal is much more efficient in terms of our body bioaccumulating it, or is mercury just more toxic than cadmium?
Mercury is definitely probably I would assume more toxic. It's also can be more present, and it can be more easily absorbed, etc. So mercury, and it may be present in higher levels in certain types of fish. Right. So that's something that is a bit of a concern.
Okay.
And that's not something that's necessarily present naturally in food anyway. It really isn't.
So another thing, Kurt, that I might say, and I want to close out this section, I want to close out the answers to your question here. I mean, if you have follow-up questions, please put them in the comments and we'll react to those, is that it's easy to raise money fear-mongering. And so if I want to, I'll just leave it there. It's very easy to raise money fear-mongering, a lot easier to raise money fear-mongering than it is for something that is positive. And so, I'm not accusing anybody of being a bad actor in this respect. I'm just recognizing that is a fact of life in the world we live in today. And it's an unfortunate fact of life. So Keith, before we jump into, we're pushing your other tests down a little bit. What I want to do is I want to go back to this As You Sow website. And there are two things that I want to show you. So the first one here, what I want to do is I want to go take a look. Here is a Taza chocolate, which is listed at 95 dark. So 95% dark, right? And we have this 2 Taza chocolates that we have a bunch of products here that have red boxes on them, which indicate that, consuming one serving of this has enough latent cadmium or lead to provide a problem if that's the only thing you ate that day and your body absorbed 100% of the cadmium or lead in the product. But so there are 50 of these to a page. We've probably got, 40 or more, right, which are red. But now let me go up here and filter by chocolate type and click to 95 to 100% cacao. And you'll notice that only one of the products which were listed show up here. So if I reset the filter here and we sort, we find that we have, this Taza. When I filter by 95, it doesn't show up. When I filter by 95, does it show up? Let's sort, right? So It doesn't show up. I mean, they don't show up here as being an issue. And so what I want to point out is that this is a really, really badly designed table, right? Because there's a whole lot of data there that I can't see that I would like to see, right? And the sorting capabilities are not very good. And it appears that whoever coded this, right, did a bad job of coding it, so that I can see that there are a bunch of 95% or even a 72%. So if I click in here and go to 65 to 95%, none of the 70% products show up in here.
And that brings to mind, like, if in your first screenshot with the Taza, that was a 95% bar. Mm-hmm. If you clicked on 90 to 95% or 95 to 100%, it should show up.
Right.
And it doesn't seem to.
It doesn't.
And I'm thinking, okay, then what gives? Something here? It's either a coding issue or it's an analysis issue or something else.
I'm not willing to attribute malice when incompetence explains the situation.
Yeah.
But this is why, and while we were waiting for Keith to join it, this is why I'm talking, and I've talked about this in the past, getting the data and being able to look at the data under here and see what it is that's going on to be able to get a better handle on what's being presented is really, really important. So one of the things I did is using Evernote, I copied all of the data from the table, and as you sow, I copied all of this data into an Excel spreadsheet because Excel gives me much better sorting capabilities. Right? And so there are a couple of interesting things that I learned. The first one of which is that if I scroll down here, what we do is we find that there are 417 entries in the table, right? So I know how many entries there are. But what I found was that these two entries, so it's the same chocolate, Endangered Species Chocolate Company, 72% cocoa espresso beans, right? These have the same testing date. And so it appears that there is redundancy in the data. So one of these entries should be removed, right? And here's another example, right? Two of these, because these appear to be the same product, two of these three should be removed. I look at here, right? These are three products. They appear to be the same product, same testing date. Two of these should be removed. So right now I'm looking at something like, I have no idea what the percentage of redundant data is. But what I'm doing is if I look at the number of entries in the table, what we do is we find that 12% of them are over the limit. Some of them are going to be redundant. 4% of them weren't tested. And like 0.5% of them, there's no cadmium detected whatsoever. But most importantly is that 1/3 of the products that were tested come from 3 different companies only, right? So in terms of this being a fair sample of the market, it is heavily skewed to ChocolateLife, right? So this is going to be chocolate which is manufactured by Barry Callebaut, right? Trader Joe's, it's a mixture of companies that provide the chocolate to them, and Hershey's. And this is not an analysis that you're going to be able to get out of the table that's presented, right? It was really, really interesting. And so I also went through and highlighted in red, cadmium that was in red. I'm going through and you'll notice that it says 72% cacao here. And so what I'm doing is I'm putting the cacao number and putting it in a separate table. And then I'm organizing each one into different categories. So I can say, give me all the cocoa powders, give me all the plain dark bars, give me things with inclusions. And one of the things you'll find, Keith, and I think this is really, really important, that if you start looking at the products for which very low levels are reported, so 0 in lead and 0 in cadmium, a fair percentage of them are candy, so M&Ms, Russell Stover, let's get these up, Snickers bars, things that
I would call chocolate coated candy.
Well, chocolate candy, number one, but also a lot of the products which have very low levels are ones where kids would be expected to consume them.
They would.
Right. So
much more favored by kids.
Right. I believe that every single milk chocolate on here has low levels. Unfortunately, I'd have to actually go and calculate from the nutrition label, for this Toblerone bar, how much of it was chocolate.
And just for anybody watching, if it's a 60% bar and a 30% milk chocolate bar from the same batch of cocoa beans, that 30% bar is going to have half the amount of cadmium, whatever it was. Yeah. So, are you going to have less in milk chocolate? Yes. Do people tend to prefer milk chocolate over dark? Yes. So who's at risk here? People who like very, very dark chocolate. Right. Okay.
And even then, the answer might not to be reduce your chocolate consumption. It might be, let's go and be more mindful about the other things I consume, right, in my diet, especially when I'm consuming the chocolate, because I'm guessing that if I'm consuming something with chocolate as opposed to at another meal of the day, it's going to interfere with the absorption of cadmium more likely if it's consumed at the same time.
Right. And to be fair, also, we mentioned cocoa powder as something that or other fiber, there's something that helps hinder the absorption. Cocoa powder happens to be loaded with fiber.
Right.
Depending, it's 20 to 35% fiber by dry weight, in most cases. So that's a lot of fiber going on there. Right. And again, so for chronic exposure, can I just, touch on what my levels were?
So let's do that now. So we're going to jump back over into here and jump back over to here. And so the blood test, as you have explained, Keith, the blood test is for acute toxicity, right? Whereas a urine test is going to be talking about chronic exposure. So let's go there. Let's talk about.
This is chronic exposure. So this is basically my scorecard of my lifestyle, so to speak. And so urine test 24 hours, and I was very diligent. It was 24 hours, like to the minute. So
this is multiple samples over the course of 24 hours?
Yes. I mean, basically, it's not a pleasant thing to do, which is sort of like, you make sure that you don't void until you get home or someplace where you can keep your bucket that they give you. Right. And you basically pee in the bucket, so to speak. And well, that's what you do. Yeah. And you have to make sure that nothing goes into the toilet. It's really right there. So not to turn anybody off, but this is healthcare. So a little bit of clinical description here. And you do it 24 hours and send it all in, warts and all, and they analyze it and send you the results. And so that's what I did. The reference range is, and this is micrograms per liter, which would be the equivalent of parts per million, I think.
Well, a liter is 1,000 milliliters. So we're already at 1,000, and half a thousandth of a gram. So 1,000th of 1,000th. So It's like parts per billion.
Yeah, it's parts per billion. Okay.
Gotcha.
And so it is 5 milligrams per liter is the reference range. You want it less than that.
Micrograms?
So,
Micrograms,
yes, per liter. And it has to be less than that. That would be the upper limit of acceptable. And mine, with all my cocoa powder consumption and my dark chocolate consumption, was 0.5. So literally 1/10 the amount. Now I'm thinking, I ain't got anything to worry about, which frankly, I don't. And I looked at the only thing that I could find online that looked, in the study, looked at people who were doing, they were testing this, and their ranges among people who are high cocoa consumers, mine was still a little bit higher than theirs. Theirs was like topped out at around like the top 25, the top quartile, the top 25% were about 0.37, 0.39, something like that. So mine was a little bit higher. Am I worried? No. And this sort of indicates that I would almost have to be consuming 10 times the amount that I'm consuming now.
And you still may not reach the threshold.
Right. And then keep in mind, if I were consuming that much chocolate, other issues there, and you'd probably be pushing out other sources of foods in the diet that would otherwise contain cadmium. So bottom line, getting the chocolate out of cadmium getting the cadmium out of chocolate rather is something that is a laudable thing to do. You can start, can work on efforts to remediate it from the soil. But overall, I'd say it seems more of a solution in search of a problem. And right now, a bit of a tempest in a teapot.
Right. So I suppose when top line, just so we can, put an exclamation point on this, and please feel free to let me know to concur or object to this, is that it doesn't matter what the tested levels of cadmium are in the product you eat. What matters is how much of that you eat and how much of what you eat ends up as metabolites in the body. And in this particular case, it's going to be in the bloodstream, in the liver, or in the kidneys. And yes?
Oh, and I would say yes. Okay. And also not to focus on single sources, right, but looking at a total diet.
Right. So again, for some reason, when it comes to child labor and when it comes to cadmium, cocoa is being singled out over lots of other supply chains where there is a problem and lots of other foods where there is arguably a much greater problem. So,
and this also, as research goes, this was a sample size of 1, so keep that in mind. That on the other hand, I do know what I've been eating, and it didn't seem to be a problem for me. And do I want to extrapolate that? There might be somebody for whom it is a problem. So I don't want to rule that out. This, nutrition science is constantly evolving. We might find something else down the road. And if it is a credible, revealing thing that's credible, then I am more than willing to adjust my position on things.
Right. It's also important to know that there are confounding factors. So if you're a smoker, you're likely having a very high intake of cadmium associated with your smoking. And so chocolate may be more toxic if you're also a smoker. So we needed to be thinking of confounding factors. So what I'm going to say is, if you're out there and you have good health insurance, right, and you have insurance that will pay for these tests, and you're like a chocolate maker, you're consuming your chocolate every day with beans from all over the world, and what you'd like to do is you'd like to get a blood test for cadmium and get a urine test for cadmium, and share your results anonymously. We'd be happy to do that so we can increase the sample size. I'm interested in knowing if it's a problem for you. It doesn't appear to be a problem for me.
Right. And I would say the test, actually, I didn't have insurance that would cover it, so I paid for it myself. Okay. And each one was about $100.
Okay. So if you are personally concerned, this seems to be a relatively small amount to pay for peace of mind.
Yep.
Okay. Great. And that's the TLDR. If you're consuming reasonable percentage of calories in your diet from either cocoa or chocolate. So let's say you're on a 2,000 calorie a day diet and you're saying, I'm going to consume 200 and 250 calories a day out of cocoa or chocolate. You shouldn't have a problem either with short-term toxicity or chronic exposure. I am not a doctor. Go talk to your doctor about it to see if it's an issue for you. But it appears to be that the scare is overblown.
And as a clinician and a pediatric nutritionist of many years, I want to say, okay, but look, what else are you eating in your diet?
Yeah,
and that's got to count too. And I focus a lot more on that. And too many people have too far to go in sort of balancing out their diets. Only 1 in 10 people actually gets even enough fruit and vegetables. That's something that we need to concentrate on. This is not.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I also want to point out, Keith, the final point I want to make in this, you talked about your results being a sample size of 1.
Right.
Right. What I want to point out is that the sample size that As You Sow put together is also incredibly tiny. When 1/3 roughly of the sample products come from 3 companies, right? And one of the things you may see that I'm trying to do with this spreadsheet, I'm trying to find out, who is the source of the chocolate for these products. So for example, if you're C's, the source of the chocolate is most likely Guittard. I think endangered species is Blommer. Everything from CHocolateLife comes from Barry Callebaut. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out, do this background, where the origin. So if they have an origin for the chocolate listed, I'm putting the origin there, just trying to, flesh out the details, but understand that this is an incredibly small sample size, right? And so should we make policy decisions based on what appear to be very, very small sample sizes and an incomplete understanding? And that's one of the things we want to do. The amount of cadmium that's in the product is not an indicator of how bad it is for you. There are lots of confounding factors.
And also, does this all mean that it just sort of reinforces that West African cocoa beans are not going to be high in cadmium, just because the soil isn't very high in cadmium. So anything you make out of those beans is not going to be very high in cadmium. And other companies that get their beans, maybe some from there, but also some from Southeast Asia or South America, etc., that is a different soil. It's probably going to be a little bit higher. That said, do we need to care about that, or do we need to worry about it as a health problem? And my take is probably not. And I don't think I'm alone there. My opinion is not radical. Put it that way.
Right. Yes. It's not fringe, as we would say. Right. And it is more in line with accepted science than the other way around. So, my goal here was to take a real brief look at this. Obviously, this is a topic where the back and forth can go hours and hours and hours. But I'm hoping to do some more work on this chart and provide feedback actually to the people at As You Sow about what I think about their bad data, the redundancy of data that they've got in their chart, and the bad coding of the table, so that hopefully they'll fix it and they won't be inadvertently misrepresenting what it is that they're trying to promote.
Yeah, I don't think there's malice there. I think it's sort of,
you never attribute to malice that which can be attributed to incompetence.
Right.
Yeah, I think is this. This is just people who are not data centric, who don't really understand the importance of data cleanliness, and people who don't check their coding, right? So, if we go to this, right, why does, 95 not show up? I'll bet you it's a boundary condition, and the code is -1, and and it should be 1,
it doesn't fall into either one.
Are they starting at 0? Or are they starting at 1? What are they doing? I mean, these are, very, very simple coding problems, and I'm guessing that's where they are. And so for me, part of the experience was to go and actually go take a look at this and try to make sense of it. And I can't, right? And so that's why this has been interesting to me. And I will contact some people at As You Sow and say, hey, I think you got some pretty serious problems with what you're representing here.
Which also brings us to the point where, and a researcher would be tagged on this.
Right. This would never pass peer review.
My God, no.
No. So, which is really interesting is, hey, everybody, right? This is not a peer-reviewed study.
And there's a reason for that, because it wouldn't.
Yeah, there is a reason
want to look
for
at
that,
methodology.
because if it were peer-reviewed, I don't think it would pass.
No, they would get dinged on this instantly, and a statistician would have a field day,
right.
And they would have to say, look, resubmit. It's not going to work.
Yeah. So just really quickly. So Keith, in the 10 minutes or so that we have before scheduled ending, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, it's another chemical which is commonly used in confectionery, which is titanium dioxide. Now, right. I know you're not a toxicologist, so you're not going to speak to it from that perspective, but in your, pediatric nutrition hat on, and how we might, translate that into adults as well as children. Can you tell me what the controversy is about titanium dioxide?
Well, there are kind of two, because I should say titanium dioxide has been around for a long time. It has what's called GRAS status. GRAS is an acronym for generally regarded as safe. So it kind of got grandfathered when GRAS status was established, and things like salt or grass and, sugar or grass and, a lot of things that are considered to be benign. From a toxicology standpoint. So those are also, titanium dioxide it will, the phone will die. Hold on.
Yeah, no worries.
By
the way, everybody, this is live and it's real life. We're not in a studio.
Live in real life,
this
and
is
I'm
warts
not in
and
my
all.
office.
This
I'm
is
in
what we're doing here.
Yeah,
right?
in home.
Yep.
So it's been around for a long time. It's also not just in foods. It is in toothpaste. It's in all kinds of face
sunscreen.
creams. Pardon?
Sunscreen.
Sunscreen. Yes. Oh, absolutely.
If it's white, basically
and it's
anything
actually,
that's white.
It's white, but it's also it makes things creamy and smooth, and it has benefits that go beyond and it's a good sunscreen. I mean, just in and of itself,
it's a physical sunscreen.
It's physical sunscreen. So it can be used externally or taken internally. And as I say, with things like toothpaste and stuff, it's been there forever. It makes things white. It makes marshmallows white. If it is a homemade marshmallow, it will be a little less white. Yeah. Is that a problem? No. But if you're a manufacturer and you want to have something pure white, you get titanium dioxide. Right. So this became an issue. Is it a toxic thing? Well, depends on how you define toxic, I guess. And it also, or how much of an issue is this? Well, then we have detection levels now. That are getting down to what we call nanoparticles, which are very, very, very tiny things. Mm-hmm. And titanium dioxide has always been considered to be pretty benign. You don't really absorb much of it. With nanoparticles, it's been found that you can, and some people do. And a lot of the studies that I found really focused on toxicology in vivo studies, but also in vitro studies. In vitro studies would be like the Petri dish, the test tube, that kind of thing. In vivo studies most oftenly are in animals, and most oftenly either mice or rats. Excuse me.
But rice or rats works.
Yeah, it's like I don't like either one of them, so it's fine. And the studies in the mice and rats are kind of all over the map. And it depends on the dosage, but even the dosages sometimes, when they are the same dosage in two different studies, they find different things.
Right. So Keith, do you know if the dosages in the different studies are controlled for particle size and particle size distribution?
No, they are. Yeah.
Okay.
They are, and at the same time, they would get dinged for that too. I mean, that's a definite. That's part of the deal. But also, has it been found in our organs? Yes, it has. Mm-hmm. It's also not always that way. So the studies do vary. But has it been found in the organs? Okay, if it has, then some people or some organizations would say that's a problem. Mm-hmm. And not necessarily everybody would. If you find it there, does that mean it's causing a problem? Or does that mean it can lead to a problem? What does that mean just because you can detect it in an organ? And you might say, well, I don't want it there. But if it's, titanium is, again, one of those elements, and titanium dioxide has probably been around in some form for many, many years. Where do we take this? And so the European Union has banned it from food, I believe. I'm not sure they banned it from everything.
I believe France has banned it. I don't know about the rest of the EU. Yeah. So even within the EU and countries that hew to the Codex Alimentarius very closely, there is still some dispute about its safety.
Right, and there is, was it found to cause cancer it possibly causes cancer by the International Association for Research on Cancer, that's IARC, which is sort of a subdivision of the Food and Agricultural Organization /WHO. Yep. I will tell you that IARC's credibility has really suffered because they kind of attribute everything to cancer. I mean, they think everything causes cancer, including,
Keith?
Yes.
Life causes cancer.
Well, no,
if you're not alive, you don't get cancer. I mean,
right. And
it's extended lifespans. When we only lived to 20 or 30, it wasn't as much as a problem. But now that we're living to 70 or 80, it's more of a problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, things like also coffee causes cancer, being a hairdresser causes cancer. So, these kinds of things.
So if I'm a coffee loving hairdresser, who loves chocolate, I'm in real problem.
Yeah. It's like, it's amazing you may get it through a whole day. So, IARC's credibility has been subject fairly to question.
Right. So the reason why I wanted to bring up titanium dioxide is that it's another metal or compound that, like cadmium, can be found associated with chocolate. Now, titanium dioxide is not naturally occurring in chocolate, but when it comes to chocolate, is used in decorations. So
Right.
you might find that titanium dioxide is applied to the surface of a mica or some other substrate. So you get, at one size, you'd get glitter, and at another size, you get luster dust. And
Right.
so if I'm looking for a really white coloring on top of a chocolate, cocoa butter with titanium dioxide, right? If I'm looking for a really, really white cocoa butter or really, really white chocolate, it has titanium dioxide in it to get those
it can
colors.
be, like the coating on a donut or something like that makes it very creamy and very smooth, and those nanoparticles kind of smooth everything out. So from a food science and technology standpoint, it has its benefits. It also does have some significant health benefits.
Ooh, such as?
Yeah, such as it can be a good delivery vehicle for certain medications. It's used in certain cancer preparations, for example, anti-cancer treatments or cancer treatments. So it's
even though it might cause cancer, it's used in anti-cancer treatment.
Well, it's in chemotherapy drugs and things like that as a delivery vehicle, and in forms that I am not skilled in speaking about, but I do know that it is used in therapeutic treatments as at least a component of some of these, and serves various functions there.
Right.
So it's not always a bad thing. I doubt the European Union banned it from there. But also,
okay.
So I would seriously doubt that. So these kinds of bans can have political ramifications on both sides. If you ban it, you're being concerned about your population. If you then are among those countries or governing bodies that don't ban it, somebody wants to say why they did. Right. Why aren't you?
Right.
And so then that's how political discussions about these sorts of things become generated. Right. Who's looking out for me more? And to say it's not a problem is difficult. It's much easier to say it's a problem, or we don't know if it's a problem, so we're going to play it safe. And with titanium dioxide, it appears that the research is not terribly conclusive on this, although I would say, from what I've read, it doesn't look based on what I've read and the population study that's happened over the last 50 years.
Right. Do you know if it's a bioaccumulator? I mean, does the body purge it, or if I get titanium dioxide in my body, is it there forever, or am I?
No, it's generally it's excreted.
Okay.
It does, if you absorb it, it does eliminate. It doesn't eliminate quite so fast, but you don't absorb a whole lot of it either. Then the studies are kind of all over with this. So some studies have shown, and some very, very good studies have shown, was not toxic, not a problem. There was no issue whatsoever. Other studies have shown that they've shown more problems.
So and when you're doing a meta-analysis, what you can do is you can choose the studies you include in your meta-analysis to be able to come up with the conclusion that you're looking to.
Although I did see some studies, like individual studies, that were well done, and at different dosages and for different lengths of time. And so they kind of pool these into a meta-analysis and say, okay, if we treated this big meta-analysis as one big group, what do we come up with?
Gotcha. So before we go, because we're a little past the hour, what I want to do is I'm going to provide a link to this page in today's post, this is in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations. So it's in Title 21, which is where the regulations for chocolate are in Section 163. So 21.163 are cocoa products. But if we look at 21 subchapter, Chapter 1, Subchapter A, what you can do is you can go and look and you can see all of the sections that talk about color additives. So here we have Part 70, which talks about, so Color additive petitions, these are for colors that are currently under review by the FDA for certification. So you have a listing of color additives that are exempt from certification. So these are things that are generally recognized as safe, so grass, or might be natural. So a strawberry color derived from strawberries, as opposed to a strawberry color derived from beets. Strawberry.
With titanium dioxide, I want to make one point clear is that when IARC looked at studies of humans, they didn't look at studies of titanium dioxide in food. They did find 4 studies where of inhaled titanium dioxide, which is more of a concern.
Very, very. I can imagine dust in the lungs.
Right, exactly. So that's a different mode of entry.
Right. Well, but what it says is if I'm using an airbrush to spray titanium dioxide, which is suspended in cocoa butter, then the use of a respirator, right, or at least a mask, is probably should be considered as a requirement. So that I'm not inhaling.
I would say that if you're doing something that's airbrushing or spraying, I'd say it's probably good practice anyway.
I agree, but it's not everyone does, and so it's something to consider.
And whether it's titanium dioxide or cadmium, or frankly, fiber, you've heard that adage that the dose makes the poison, and every time I hear that, I want to say yes, but the dose also brings the benefit. Too much fiber, not good. Bad, but not enough, equally bad. So again, it's the right dose, not too much or too little.
Great. Well, Keith, I want to thank you for joining me today. I want to remind everybody who's been watching this live or who comes to this after the fact that you can go to TheChocolateLife.com, and if you click on the post for today's live stream, you can find all of the background information. And what I do is after the live stream, if there are references which are brought up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert those references into the bottom of the post. It'll say resources or references or something like that, and there'll be a list of links or cards that you can go to. You can find out more information on all of the things that we've discussed. And then I think it's really important as we talk about these things, Keith, to provide the links to the sources that we're using, so that if you have any questions about what it is that we're talking about or our interpretations of what it is that we're talking about, we're not lawyers, we're not scientists. I'm not a doctor. You have nutritional training, Keith, but I certainly do not. I rely on people who do have that training, and I try to do the best job I can interpreting what's going on. But if you're at all concerned, go and take a look at the original sources that we're talking to. And if you are a member of The Chocolate Life, what you can do is you can go and add comments on The Chocolate Life itself. And so if you want to ask questions, you can certainly put them in the comments here on YouTube or Facebook or LinkedIn, wherever you're watching today, or you can go to TheChocolateLife.com, become a member. Just click on join, and you'll find that always been a free membership level. So, any form of support. But if you'd like to be able to financially support what it is we're doing, I don't say no. I appreciate all of the support that I can get from you. And just briefly, we'll be back on Tuesday at the same time, noon. I don't know what the topic is yet. I have some ideas. I'm traveling to Ecuador, and then I think Portugal and Venice for the rest of October. And so my live stream schedule is going to be dependent upon where I am and whether or not I have a Wi-Fi connection for the rest of the month. But what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to do a sort of like my travel preview. I'm going to let everybody know what it is that I'm doing so that, number one, you can follow along while I'm gone, but also if you have particular questions. So if I'm going to Ecuador, I'm going to be spending some time in the north in Puerto Quito, in the province of Pichincha, which is where the capital of Quito is, spending 4 days there. Then I'm going on to Guayaquil, and I'll be spending about a week in Guayaquil, and I'll be visiting 2 different cacao farms, a chocolate manufacturer, the head of the president and executive director of the National Cacao Federation, and I'll be visiting the National Cacao Museum while I'm there. So, I'm really excited for what it is I'm doing there. So if you want to, ask questions about things that you'd like to see in Ecuador. From Ecuador, I think I'm going to Portugal. And then from Portugal, I think I'm also going to Venice. So while I'm in Portugal, straight to Venice. So it's an exciting month for travel.
I have one question for you.
Of course.
Ecuador is kind of always a country that fascinated me. And I want to know, they have some great sources of cocoa in there.
Yeah.
How do Ecuadorians consume cocoa and chocolate, or do they all these great, Arriba Nacional beans, etc.? Do they export all that, or do they keep some of it? And how do people who live in Ecuador, take their chocolate?
So that actually, Keith, is one of the topics that I want to be able to explore while I'm there. I mean, my first visit to Ecuador was in 2003. My second visit was 2005, and that was the last time I was there. So all of my travels to South America, Bolivia, Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru, I've been to those countries a total of more than, I think, a dozen times since 2005, but I haven't been in Ecuador. So one of the questions I have, it's similar to yours, but not exactly yours, is that how did the Olmecs and the Toltecs and the Maya, right, absorb cacao into their creation mythology, right? Whereas we go to the Zamora Chinchipe Mayo culture in Ecuador, which is believed to be the first archaeological evidence of the consumption of cacao. So like 1,000 years before that in Mayan Mexico. How come it didn't become a part of their creation myth? I mean, I think that's really interesting. I mean, if we go and look at the iconography of Maya architecture and codices, there are glyphs in their languages for cocoa. There's a cacao god. I mean, there doesn't appear to be anything like that in Ecuador. And for me, it seems like it didn't occupy the same important place in the history and culture of those peoples. And when I was there in 2005, I was going to markets in Otavalo and in Guayaquil and Quito looking for iconography of cacao on their pottery and in their textiles, and it's not there.
Wow.
Right. So even post-Hispanic times, it doesn't appear to be as important as like maize, corn is. Right. So I think it's really, really interesting to do so. These are kinds of questions that I want to find out on the ground.
Especially given that they've got some fairly newly discovered fabulous heirloom varieties of cacao. And it's like, given that sort of treasure is there, you wonder why it didn't.
Yeah, well, so it's really, really interesting. So we have this, variety called Nacional, right, which is got a flavor which is called Arriba. I mean, the variety is Nacional. It is a forastero. Just everybody wants to know, Nacional cacao is a forastero type. It is not a Trinitario. It is a forastero type. And believe it or not, CCN 51 has Nacional as one of its parents. There's not a whole lot of pure Nacional. A lot of it has to do with sort of inadvertent crossbreeding. We're not paying attention to how we're positioning farms, and so they cross-pollinate. So because cacao is promiscuous, I mean, come and pollinate me, baby. I mean, the flowers, you can multiply and pollinate the same flower. So you can have hybrids in the same pod. It's a really, really interesting plant. And so there's very, very little pure anything when it comes to Nacional. But Nacional, for one reason or another, is not as productive as other varieties. It seems to be less disease resistant than other varieties. And so, I would say Ecuador has a Nacional problem. And it's not that Nacional is so important to the culture. It's just that it's been marketed as incredibly important. And so they've created this unintentionally, I'm certain, this feeling about sort of, it's like a self-imposed sense of inadequacy around Nacional, right? It's an important cultural heirloom. We need to be able to preserve it. It is at the heart, or stories about it are at the heart of the most expensive chocolate brand in the world. Is it really the greatest cocoa in the world? No country admits to growing the world's second best cocoa. Every country says we grow the world's best. I'm actually interested. There are 2 new hybrids, which I hope to be able to see in person and taste in person while I'm there. They have an unfortunate name. One of them is T800. So all I can think of is Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Terminator, the T800. But it's the T800 and T801. And apparently they have the flavor of Arriba, right? But the productivity of CCN 51.
Ooh, I think I didn't hear about that number, but I did hear some buzz about what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be, because that would solve a lot of problems for.
But it would create other problems. Even though it has the flavor of Nacional, it's not Nacional. And even though it has a better flavor than CCN 51, it has the flavor of Nacional. And so there are lots of people, lots of companies that use CCN in their recipes. And T800 has a different flavor. I mean, the potential for it's like, they put themselves in this really, really interesting catch-22.
Yeah, the logistical problem, and then how do you identify it?
Yeah, well, all these kinds of things. So
Yeah.
I'm lucky. I'm visiting with 2 plantations directly, and so I hope to be able. And I know that one of them has said we can identify T800. We can get you samples of it. Probably not chocolate made from it, but at least the cacao. And then I'm going to be visiting with the president and executive director of the National Cacao Association. I'm going to be visiting the president's farm, but I've already asked them about T800 and asked them about the potential political ramifications associated with, it's a great thing. We can grow a lot more of it. It's got the flavor we love from Nacional, but it's not Nacional. And what does that mean for uptake by the industry? I mean, would it be embraced by the industry, or would it be? It's just like a fascinating question. I'm really
also,
interested
when you get into different, like it has a better flavor, but if a large company is going to use it, it's going to change the flavor of that people are used to having.
Yep.
So although you and I might think it's a better flavor, people say, but it doesn't taste like the bar that I had, that I grew up with.
Yep.
It might be better, but it's not the same.
It will certainly be different.
It will be different.
And that may be an insurmountable problem. So, I really do need to say thank you to Andres Guzman of Hacienda Victoria. He's down in the Guayaquil area, and he has helped me build the itinerary and provided logistical support while it is that I'm there. Lila Carvajal, of Cocoa Supply here in the United States. They've done an amazing job of supporting the trip down there. I'm going to be in Puerto Quito at a small regional chocolate festival. I was recommended this by a gentleman by the name of Raul Nieto, who runs something called the Itapoa Project, which helps cocoa farmers increase their yields. So it reduces pressure on deforestation to save habitat for certain animals. So, his project is right there, and I hope to be able to go visit it over the course of a couple of days. It's going to be a fascinating reintroduction. And then, there's the National Cacao Museum, which I'm looking forward to visiting, and the opportunity to talk with some historians about this question. I mean, it's going to be like a jam-packed trip, and I am really looking forward to it. So I want to say, again, before we head out of here, I want to say thank you to Daniel Bravo, who joined us on LinkedIn this morning. He connected and did a comment on LinkedIn, which I responded to this morning. And so please, if you have comments, put them in the chat on YouTube, put them in the comments on Facebook or LinkedIn. Join the Chocolate Life, please. Support what it is that I'm doing here. And anytime you post a comment, I will do my best to respond in a timely fashion if I am not traveling. And with that, I want to say thank you, everybody. We'll be back on Tuesday. I think I'm going to spend the hour talking about what it is that I want to do on my trips, what it is that I'm doing, why it is that I'm going for the trips that I'm making in October. And then hopefully I can schedule some live streams. A live stream from Guayaquil, a live stream from Porto. I've never been to Portugal before, and a live stream to visit. This is my first visit back there since 1986. So I'm really excited about the opportunity to be all those places. And with that, thank you, everyone. And remember, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Thanks, Keith. Looking forward to the continued collaborations.
Thank you. Me too.